France has seen a turbulent autumn, with the pandemic only part of the reason. Ongoing street protests against police violence, multiple terrorist attacks. Now, President Macron wants to take back control, with legislation that critics see as a repressive turn to the right. Following terror attacks in October, a new draft law to curb the influence of Islamism would make it easier to inspect or shut radical mosques, limit homeschooling, and otherwise widen the government's powers to restrict behavior deemed harmful to the values of the Republic. Critics see those values themselves as at risk of being undermined. The legislation, along with the draft security law, is sparking pushback and protests. Our title today, Can France Stop the Cycle of Violence? Welcome to the Point. It's a pleasure to introduce our guests. Raphael Bossong works for the Berlin-based think tank SWP with a focus on counterterrorism policy in the European Union. And he says, the Islamist threat for Europe remains high, but France seems to have the wrong focus in its fight against terrorism. And great to have with us once again Geraldine Schwartz. She works as an author and journalist and says the antagonism between the right-wing conservative and the left-wing secular camps in France reveals the weaknesses of a country where the rules of democracy, transparency, responsibility, dialogue, compromise are still not solidly anchored. And we're very pleased to welcome Yasmine Ural. She is a sociologist at the University of Leipzig, and she says France currently has a highly bellicose rhetoric that not only leads to extreme polarization, but also prevents in-depth debate on historical and social issues. Let me start by asking you, Raphael Bossong, because you acknowledge that the threat is high. The French government says that it is simply aiming at reinforcing principles of secularism and gender equality. What's so misguided about that?
Well, it's the risk to conflate these much bigger social issues, which do have to be tackled, with the more specific threat of terrorism. And I'm not saying that there isn't some connection, but it would be advisable to rather be focused on specific counterterrorism measures and then have a separate debate as far as possible. And as it's done now, it really sort of fosters polarization and really accentuates the polarization.
And polarization, of course, was one of the problems that you mentioned, Yasmine Ural. You accused the government of bellicose rhetoric, but the Prime Minister firmly denies that this law is anti-Islam or even anti-religion, saying the goal is emancipation from religious fundamentalism. In fact, separation of religion and state is a long-standing tradition in France.
It is true. It's a long-standing tradition, but I think their words are very powerful. So if you constantly use the word war when you want to prevent something, then it creates a kind of atmosphere that it has this fear, like people have this fear of being in a civil war, and everybody agrees that the enemy comes from within, but nobody takes the time to really define where and who the enemy is, and this creates a very ambiguous situation, which can become very dangerous for democracy.
Geraldine Schwartz, you say the rules of democracy are still not solidly anchored in France. That will come as a surprise to many viewers who see France as one of the cradles of democracy and republicanism.
Yes, the different crises that France is facing right now, because there are many crises, not only Islamism, are bringing up to the surface different structural problems that France have been for 10, 20, 30 years. And one of the structural problems is an institutional problem. The fact that the power is concentrated in the hands of one man, the president, nowadays Macron, at the expense of the parliament, and also the fact that the power is concentrated in one site, which is Paris, at the expense of the region. is damaging the idea of compromise and of dialogue, which is actually very important in a democracy. The other structural problem that this crisis is showing is what you mentioned, the tradition of secularism. This tradition of secularism was normally intended to be a kind of framework for the relationship between state and the church. And now it's being instrumentalized against Islam. This is the second structural problem. And the third would be the relationship that France has with its colonial past, brutal colonial past. And as far as now, France hasn't really faced this history, which, of course, creates resentment among the Muslim community.
Let's come back to that in just a moment, but I would first like to take a closer look at the threat to which the government is responding. More than 250 people have died in terror attacks in France over the past 5 years. That is more than in any other Western country during the same period.
In mid-October, history teacher Samuel Paty was killed and beheaded in the middle of the street in a Paris suburb. The perpetrator, an 18-year-old Islamist. His motive? The teacher had showed caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad from the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo during his lessons as an example of freedom of expression. That was followed by an attack on religious freedom less than 2 weeks later. During a knife assault in a church, 3 people were killed and several were injured. Shortly before the stabbing, the perpetrator had traveled illegally to France. A few days later, France commemorated the 130 people killed and the hundreds injured in Paris on November 13, 2015. On that day, multiple attacks were carried out at several locations in the city, including a stadium and at a concert in the Bataclan Theater. The IS terrorist group took credit for the attacks, which many French people view as an assault on their liberal values. There have been 260 Islamist-motivated attacks in France since 2012. The country is gripped by fear of another attack. What are the right strategies in the fight against terrorism?
Yasmin Oral, is it really so surprising that the French government resorts to martial rhetoric after dealing with this kind of a threat for 5 years?
Yes and no. It's not surprising because France has also, had this tradition of brutal attacks and having recourse to repression in a certain way. But also, no, it should not be the answer, I guess, to have a very, very warlike rhetoric that we have also seen in the war on terror, right? I mean, the words are very important, and I think we shouldn't let this happen that as if there was a civil war going on.
I would like to add, the threat is considerable, but we are really not in the same situation as in 2015 to 17 anymore. So it doesn't help making these analogies all the time. Bataclan, there are things to be taken care of, but at the current moment we had individual attackers, improvised means, who killed very few people. I don't want to denigrate this, but we shouldn't be panicking.
Mm-hmm. In other words, the scale of the threat now is smaller than it was at that time?
Well, we cannot rule out that there will be a new major attack, but the last sequence of attacks has not been of the same quality, and hence there isn't a need to respond as forcefully.
Geraldine, how has this series of attacks, how has it affected French society in general? How has France changed, let's say, since Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan?
There is a real demand for more authority from the society. And you can see actually that, of course, the evolution of this terrorist attack are going hand in hand with the evolution of French society wanting more and more these kind of responses that Macron and the government are giving now to their society. And this separatism we are talking about, you were mentioning the civil war that the government is actually fostering. We must not forget actually where that comes from, and that the Muslim Brothers, jihadism, they are the first to use this vocabulary of them and us, kuffar, the infidels, yes, who deserve death. So we should also be very aware of where the problem comes from.
I want to come back to the separatist aspect in just a moment, but Raphael Besson, let me ask you to talk a little bit about the particular situation in France, because as I understand it, an unusually high share of European jihadists are in fact young French men. Why is that? What makes France unique?
Well, one could give a very long answer to that. But first of all, of course, France has the biggest Muslim population in Europe. And it does have some structural problems we heard about. So there is a potential reservoir of alienated people who are in search of a new identity, an alternative identity, and that is exploited by certain actors. So I would also say this is the second part of the equation. It's not only structural problems, but also active recruitments and an active ideology. And France inherited some of this already in the 90s from the Algerian wars, and there is a particular North African networks at work here. So it's a historically grown threat. It's persistent, it's serious, but as I said, it's not of a new quality. And hence, I don't think there is a need to add law after law after law to repress it.
And Yasmin, let me again come back to the topic of polarization, because as Geraldine touched upon, the French government actually sees polarization as rooted in separatism, saying that Islamist social services, radical mosques are creating parallel worlds and inculcating values that are diametrically opposed to the values of French republicanism. Is there something to that argument?
I mean, it's clear that there has been a violent incident and brutal incident. I mean, and there are problems in that. But at the same time, to go back to this rhetoric and say they started it and we're going to continue this, it would only but repression will only increase violence again, right? I mean, if they started it, then we will have to again go back to the roots of the problem, which is not only them, kafir, kufr, but also problems that you have also mentioned, colonialism, social problems, racism. So we cannot just say that there's a problem and we're just going to use repression.
Geraldine, you talked about French values of democracy in your opening statement. Is there an argument here that if France truly wants to reinforce the fundamental principles of the Republic, it should be doing more for égalité and fraternité, those two founding values, equality and brotherhood?
I'm not sure actually the problems are really linked. I would say it's much more linked to the colonial past of France and the problems France has to integrate the second, third generation of those who came after the Algerian War, specifically to France. One big problem of France is that they built cities in the periphery to welcome these migrants coming from the former colonies, so that these banlieues, what we name banlieues, and this was actually
often translated as suburbs.
Of suburbs, yes, which are totally explosive, as you know, and so it's also an urbanistic exclusion, and I think this kind of exclusion is even stronger than social inequality understood as income or it's this physical exclusion of Muslim communities out of the city center.
Raphael Besson, in one French village where numerous young people have actually joined the Islamist State, the mayor says that the government, partly at least, bears responsibility for doing too little to integrate them. Is this ultimately also about social exclusion? And is a security clampdown simply easier than perhaps putting into place the kind of social reforms that would really make a difference?
Well, security measures are always better to communicate, but of course, to really do them effectively is maybe just as hard as promoting integration. But I think every case is slightly different, and I fully agree there is a problem with the banlieue. At the same time, we also see that not all the attackers have come from this kind of particular setting, that we have cases like in a village where it's other forms of social network that drive people to attacks. So there is not one size fits all explanation. What I would be, but in general, more concerned about in France is that France has been late with preventive strategies in comparison to strong repressive strategies. They recognize it. It is a topic of discussion, but there is a lot of talk and seemingly very little structural changes happening afterwards. And so I think that will be a very negative outcome of this debate if Macron wants to change it, but it might be just presidential declarations and no infrastructure to really make it happen.
Yes, Amina, meanwhile, parallel to this debate over the new law on Islamism, France has also been seeing ongoing protests over police violence and also over a new security law that would limit citizens' ability to film examples of police repression. President Macron is fond of saying that French democracy is colorblind, that if you're a French citizen, it simply absolutely doesn't matter what color your skin is. Is he wrong? Does France have a problem with not only dealing with its colonial history, but simply with racism?
Macron is also the one who says if you don't have the right color, like right skin color, you are controlled 3 times more. He also admits that there's a problem, a structural problem, racism problem within the police, but also within the larger French community. And it's very unfortunate that these 2 laws are discussed at the same time, right? I mean, the law on the general security and the law against Islamism, which is actually not named Islamism. It used to be called separatism, and now they're calling it again strengthening the principles of the Republic, so Republican principles. So I think Macron or the general debate is not clear about who the enemy is again, and the debate is very emotional. So I think there are reactions that are extremely emotional from the side of the state that can really be a problem and make people who don't belong to the majority society in threat.
Geraldine, would you say that France has a problem with systemic racism, at least on the part of the police?
Oh, yes, like every country. I mean, one of the problem of the police abuses in France is also just linked also to the way the police is trained. There was, since June of this year, the training of the police has been reduced from 12 months in the school to 8 months. So you see young policemen arriving and try, to maintain the order in explosive situations, having a rifle, assault rifle sometimes, and they are absolutely not trained. In Germany, the focus is much more on ethic, social skills and soft skills, and this is not taught in France. So I don't know if the racial structural problem is worse in France than in Germany, but the way to prevent it is, of course, very weak in France.
Raphael, not only from Muslims within France, but also from a number of countries abroad, especially Muslim countries, there has been a backlash in reaction to the government's response to the recent terrorist attacks, even including calls to boycott French goods. Why has this touched such a nerve abroad, and should Macron be worried?
Well, domestically, it maybe only strengthens him, but it takes 2 to tango, maybe we could say. I mean, I wouldn't put the blame squarely on Macron to kind of make an aggressive rhetoric and sort of alienate Muslim countries. I mean, of course, Erdogan was happy to jump on it and make his own domestic points for that and sort of pretends he's the protector. So, I mean, that's the trap we're seeing. And so I think probably Macron himself, as I said, would maybe domestically strengthened by it. But from a strategic point of view for Europe as a whole, I think we would all be better served not giving an offer to people like Erdogan to take up and say, look, they don't like us, and I'm your leader after all, even if you live in Europe. I think that's something we should really avoid.
So let me come back to the point that you made about it possibly strengthening Macron domestically, because the fact is, following the latest terrorist attacks, security has high priority not only for the president, but also for many French citizens. Macron's crackdown on Islamism is supported by a majority of voters, according to polls, with a wide majority seeing France's form of secularism in danger.
Our citizens must be protected. Our citizens of Islamic faith must be protected against the evil of radical Islam. I'm saying this because the intention of the Islamists, the intention of these ideologues, is to turn part of our population against the Republic. And we cannot let that happen.
Yasmin, speaking of resonating with citizens and voters, would you say that the vote on the new law on Islamism, which is scheduled for October 2021, is this very much about French elections? And are we seeing essentially the French government motivated as much by political opportunism as by principle?
I think the way the word is mobilized within the right wing since years is like trying to add it to the three pillars like liberté, égalité, et fraternité, and to get laïcité as part of France has been there already. And I think Macron is trying not to lose this right-wing part of the society and puts a lot of emphasis on laicity without taking the time, again, to define what it is, what has been, what it was historically, and what it came to represent today.
Laïcité being that unique French form of secularism. Géraldine, to what extent can Macron be sure of continuing domestic political support for this course? If I look at recent polls, they show 79% of the French agree that Islamism is at war with France. 72% of socialist voters also agreed, with 90% on the center-right. That is pretty astonishing level of support. Do you think that will begin to wobble?
Well, actually, there is a shift inside the political families themselves. Many of the left are actually traditionally very secular. So they would be for a law on the separatism in the name of secularism. But another part of the left is actually defending the Islam also a little bit like, you know, the religion of the poor, the religion of the colonized, which is also a tradition on the left. And on the right, there is also a separation in the right family between those who defend religion, you know, conservative, Catholic circles, and those like Sarkozy, for example, or the Minister of Interior, who are leading a real war for secularism, which is actually an excuse for a war against Islamism. So it is instrumentalizing secularism to actually lead a war against Islamism. And we are celebrating this year 150 years of the law of separation of the state and the church, 1905. And
in fact, this new law was announced on that very anniversary date.
Yes, but it is a perversion of this original law.
Raphael, let me take us back. Yes, you can speak to them one moment, but maybe because we're almost out of time, combine it with another look at our title. We asked whether this can stop the cycle of violence. What would be needed to stop it?
Well, first of all, we are not in this terrorist violence cycle now. Let me repeat this point. We have attacks, but we're not where we were. So we actually first should take a breath and calm down. And I think that would be the first thing that should happen. Then, yes, we should separate these kind of debates about counterterrorism and wider structural debates as far as possible. That would also help to diffuse the tension. And let me ask about this domestic issue. I'm not a French domestic policy expert, but a colleague of mine made a very interesting analysis that showed that, well, Macron came to power saying he's not right nor left, but now the party system is so fragmented that that doesn't work anymore, so he has to go to the right. And there is actually a growing population in the countryside. In contrast to many other countries, the rural France is growing. And that's also one of the reasons why he's probably going in this direction. So altogether, I think, let's just kind of let off the steam. And I don't think France has to do anything, actually.
Yasemin, do you think that Macron can unite this very divided country, divided not only by Islamist separatism, but obviously very divided in other respects as well?
I don't think so. Not with a war rhetoric. He cannot do that. And at the moment, I think he is pushing also the law that supposedly that is going to supposedly ban filming the police. And I think it's a very, very wrong direction that Macron is going into.
Geraldine, in 2 sentences, the right approach?
Well, redefined freedom. You know, freedom is not only the freedom of express yourself, but it's also the freedom for others to practice their religion.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.